Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inner City Leadership Visit collaboration between Asheville, Lexington, and Chattanooga. We're thrilled to have you joining us today for what is going to be a very vibrant discussion around bridging the digital divide and around digital equity in our country as well as in our regions and in our communities. I've had the pleasure to get to know our speakers a bit more over the last few days, and I know you're in for a treat. So thank you. And again, as I mentioned, this is our third installment. Our first session, held a couple of weeks ago, was on tourism. Our second session was on talent and workforce development. And now again, today, on bridging the digital divide and again, digital equity. So thank you. So today's program will start with a presentation from each one of our three speakers who are joined on screen with me today. And then following that, we will have a question and answer session in which we hope you will all participate. So please note that you can place your questions in the chat and you can start doing that at any time, and we will be monitoring that as we get to, again, the end of their individual remarks. And our hope in the Q&A is to make this even more conversational. You might find it conversational in the upfront segment as well, but definitely during the question and answer time. So at this point, I will go ahead and present our first speaker. I'll introduce Aldana first. So Aldana hails from Lexington. She's our Lexington representative today. So all of those Kentucky friends can be proud. And just to give you a little background on her, she is the Chief Information Officer for Lexington, Fayette, Kentucky Urban County Government. And Aldana collaborates with the Mayor's Office on several initiatives, which includes Rethink Lex, a reengineering of city operations and services. She was named Lexington's first Chief Information Officer in 2013, and she was also first appointed CIO of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and served as president of the National Association of State Chief Information Officers during her tenure. Since leaving state government, she's been vice president of consulting services at CGI. And as well, she's implemented a number of new systems, made investments in network operations, cybersecurity, public safety, and cloud-based systems. She was a co-sponsor of the Gig for Lex project, a high-speed broadband initiative for the entire city. She now has oversight for the build-out, making Lexington one of the largest gig cities. She holds a master's degree from Wayne State University in Detroit and has received numerous awards, including recognition as Public Official of the Year by Governing Magazine. She's testified before Congress, advocated for state technology issues, and has advised a number of states and governors on the CIO role and organization of the CIO office. As with our other speakers as well, she is a frequent speaker in digital equity and infrastructure. So with no further ado, Aldana, welcome to the stage today.
Thank you very much, Christy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Now I got to live up to it, right? What I'm going to talk about is really sort of dividing Lexington, Fayette County into two parts. And when we talk about digital divide, we still have the divide. It's not going to go away. But let me sort of frame what we're going to talk about first. The digital divide can be parsed into several different areas. It can be economic, it can be infrastructure, can be educational, or all of the above. And to some extent, I think that we probably are a very good example of all of the above. Lexington, horse capital of the world, extremely dense. We have an urban boundary, which means that we are not going to expand beyond that boundary. And we're getting denser and denser with every single week as people want to build something. We're trying to preserve our historic industry, the horse industry. So that's Fayette County. It is by no means all farms and necessarily rural. It has big business, but it is not nearly as dense. So when I talk about building out a gig city, I'm talking about the city within the urban boundary. And It was Mayor Gray's, the previous mayor's vision that Lexington, first of all, we do have vendors in the city who provide services. But you know what? It didn't cover the whole city. It wasn't fast enough. The upload speeds, the download speeds, and certainly had economic issues and financial issues associated. And we really did not see them investing anymore in the city. So the mayor's vision was to become a gig city, and he charged us to start looking at that possibility. As you can imagine, we spent a couple of years just doing our homework. And I'll tell you, the people that were most influential in what I learned was really visiting Chattanooga. And Deb can refer to that later on. It was visiting Chattanooga that I found out, well, they had a utility. If you got a utility, that's a plus. If you own an electric company, that means you got poles. That's a plus. And you know what? Lexington had none of that. We own no utility. We own no poles. And so consequently, our trip to become a gig city was much, much harder. What we did though, is we looked at it from a request for information. We had about a dozen companies respond. Some that just wanted to help us build, some that thought we had money. We looked at bonding. What would it cost the city if we build our own? But you know what? If you own no utility and you've never dealt with customers at that level, even if you had the money, that is a very, very steep mountain to climb. And so we ended up, after all of the examination that we did, we were fortunate enough that a company came to us and said, you know, we want to invest in Lexington. And we thought, well, why do you want to invest in Lexington? Well, they said, you've got 2 universities, you've got the horse business, you read more ebooks than anybody else in the United States. And on top of it, you're considered a smart city in a lot of ways. You've got over 40% of your population with at least a bachelor's degree or more. Consequently, we became the poster child. And the company invested $90 million in building that infrastructure. But again, let me remind you, it's within the city. It did not really touch anything in the county. The county, not as dense, not as populated, very difficult to invest. But what we found out during this entire time is that it's very, very hard to build infrastructure. Lexington hadn't built any infrastructure for 40 years. People weren't sure what right of way was, what easement meant. They didn't really know what this fiber thing was going to do. And consequently, it became up to us as a city to start educating our citizens and what that really meant. And I'll tell you, there's lots of stories to tell. At one point, after we did the plan and looked at how we were going to build, how the city would get divided, the one thing that we were able to negotiate, and that was to address the digital divide, is that the company would build throughout the entire city. So let me say it again, the entire city, not the fiberhood model, where a company comes in and says, we will build over here if you sign up for the service. Because that is the model that has been prevalent in the United States and multiple jurisdictions. We said you got to build throughout the entire city, not just asking people to build before. In order to facilitate this build out in a faster way, what the city did, and the city's contribution is to have an oversight committee. I had 12 departments, 12 divisions sitting around the table every month with the company reporting to us how many feet did they put underground, how many feet did they put overhead, and oh, by the way, attaching to the poles is a totally separate issue. And I see Deb nodding her head. It's absolutely true. You got to negotiate, and they had to negotiate. They wanted to do as much aerial fiber as underground. It is much easier. And there are parts of the city, parts of Lexington, that are historic and old, and you had to go above ground, not underground, because you really couldn't dig. The newer areas, the newer developments, we could put fiber underground. But there it became an issue. You had to call, remember, 811. Do you have a water line? Do you have a sewer line? Do you have a gas line? Do you have a cable line? That is the potential for a disaster with every one of these things. And by the way, a lot of sewer lines didn't really have a good GIS map. We didn't know where they were. They were located on one street. Oops, they weren't there. They were around the corner. And so they're story after story. But I'll just tell you two because I think they're interesting. Since people didn't know that there was an easement and people could come into your backyard, some people came out with a gun. And we had to engage the police to say, no, 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 it's okay. They have the right to do that. Some people wanted the service so badly that when the people came to dig in the yard, one woman came out with $5 bills and said to the crew that that was their lunch money because she was so happy to get the service. So there's lots of stories to tell. But anyway, this is how we proceeded. And what we thought would take 4 years, and let me say it again, 4 years is an awful long time. We were able to do because of the facilitation of the permitting, the examining, the fixing, etc. We were able to do it in 2.5. So 100,000 homes were passed with fiber in Lexington. Lexington has a population of about 330,000. And like I said, very, very dense. So now let me talk about the other part. And this is the part that we're working on right now. That is Fayette County. It borders Scott County. We've got 17 counties up and down Route 75. All of you know US Highway 75, north and south. We've got the Bluegrass Area Development District with 17 counties. But really part of what we really want to do, what is it that we can do for that population in Fayette County, which is horse farms, which has a huge auction site, Fasig-Tipton, which does international auctions of horses. We've got the stockyard, the single largest stockyard in the Midwest. We've got a huge equine hospital. What I found out throughout this process, that when someone buys a horse or bids on a horse, the owner who's bidding or the agent wants 35, let me say it again, 35 x-rays of the horse. That's a lot of data. So that's the kind of business, and this is what we're working on right now. We had a report done in 2017 of what would be the cost to do a build out in the county. And it's not anything that anybody really could afford, because if you had to put the fiber underground. So what we're doing now is engaging a number of vendors that are already working here, vendors that would like to work here, telecom companies, to see what is it that they would be willing to do, given that there's a great deal of money that's going to come. Obviously, our state is going to provide some broadband money, relief money. The federal government is going to provide relief money for broadband. And by the way, all of that was heightened as the pandemic raged all around us for the last 14 or 16 months, whatever you want the date to be. We found out one-on-one. People called me directly. Look, Aldona, I've got 2 kids that need to do their homework. I live in the county. I don't have a farm, but I have a house. My wife and I need to work from home. We cannot do this. So those are the kinds of stories. So besides the large businesses that I highlighted, we have a number of families that have moved into the county because there's a little bit more land. They can have a little bit more property, but they're going to work remotely. Their children are going to work remotely at some point. That's the point that we have to address. So that's very much a digital divide still, even though the city has done quite well. We have yet that challenge for the county. One more thing I would like to say, and that is that what we did not do, but we did finally catch up, is educate the citizens on what that really meant. I think we try to educate them. What did fiber mean? What did digging in your backyard would mean? But potentially what that would mean in terms of economic development, in terms of growth in the city, in terms of what is it from an educational background, how that would help you. That some of that digital divide still exists. And I think you're going to hear more about that. So if I had a do-over, that do-over would be to do more education at that front end about potentially what that means to the citizens of Lexington and Fayette County. I'll be happy to jump in later on when you've got questions.
Well, thank you, Aldona. What a great way to kick us off. And you brought up some great points about the amount of investment it takes for broadband infrastructure, the challenges of managing through the process. It's a major project to manage through. And then, the rural piece. And as you go out beyond our city limits and all three of our communities and within our counties, but then also our regions, the challenges of the infrastructure piece, and then your final comments about then activating the infrastructure, right? So I'm excited to see how Hunter and Deb, I know, will build on your comments and then in the Q&A. So great way to kick us off. All right, so next up we have Hunter Guzman. He is the Executive Director of the Education and Research Consortium and the Western Carolinas. With 26 plus years in IT and telecom leadership roles and 16 years leading the ERC, he is responsible for building, operating, and supporting broadband internet access across Western North Carolina via the award-winning ERC Middle Mile Network and Data Center. Hunter has also worked nationally and internationally in the telecommunications and information technology fields, gaining specific expertise in strategic planning, customer service, service delivery, and program management. He is a requested speaker and frequent panelist on the topics from middle mile networks, rural broadband access and expansion to community networking. Additionally, he is a strong community advocate and serves on the board of directors for the North Carolina Technology Association. He is currently serving as an adjunct professor of management at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and is an ardent supporter of technical internships. In his free time, he's an avid hiker, photographer, and guitarist. So welcome, Hunter, please. Hunter.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm Hunter Guzman, and for 17 years, I've been expanding fiber optic infrastructure in Western North Carolina. As of now, the nonprofit ERC Broadband operates over 5,000 miles of fiber optic cable. And let me be clear, as a nonprofit, we don't do homes, but what we do is serve customers directly and indirectly. This means we serve some customers by building into their businesses. And let me point out that our niche is education, healthcare, and government services, which in many rural areas just also happens to be the largest businesses. But when I put fiber optic cable into a community, we don't just build a couple strands. And by building additional strands, this allows us to work with other providers who do serve people at home, known as the last mile. Since I'm speaking more about infrastructure specifically, let me point out that the single greatest obstacle to our growth is money, and that's because we spend it up front during the construction of the fiber. As many of you know, the Appalachian Mountains are rocky, and I know I love to find pieces of quartz when I'm out hiking, but granite is the state rock of North Carolina for a reason, and it's renowned for its hardness. For those of us who try to put cable in the ground, this means that it's extremely difficult and costly to build. That leaves us with doing aerial construction on power poles, telephone poles, etc. And this can only happen, as Aldona pointed out, after we reach agreements with the pole owners. And this agreement establishes the rules we have to follow, as well as the cost of putting fiber on the poles. To be clear, in many rural areas, the existing poles are full and possibly already overloaded. That means that, for example, Spectrum or AT&T or Frontier or another provider fully occupy the pole or the pole route. And how do we get around it? Well, we replace the pole with a taller pole. And you guessed it, that costs more money. But this hasn't dissuaded us from growing year over year for 17 years and running. In addition to supporting our own growth, the ERC also works as a fiscal agent and grant administrator for groups who fund broadband growth. And this allows us to put out RFPs, and the winner or awardee will use their skills and own infrastructure to build broadband into an unserved or underserved area. And there are lots of them. Even Buncombe County, and where Asheville is located, it's the hub of Western North Carolina, but there also happen to be gaps in coverage. And the ERC is but one of the groups working to fill those gaps. The beauty of being a nonprofit here is that success is not determined necessarily by the ERC. The success is determined by simply finding a solution. Once the infrastructure is in place, then we can work individually or together with others to find a creative way to solve problems. The biggest internet problems we face are the ever-increasing demand for bandwidth, cyber criminals, over-reliance on major corporations, patchwork fixes. I mean, who hasn't been paying attention to the Colonial Pipeline issue, who got held up to ransomware? But as I understand it, and I may be mistaken, the origin of the problem was a known exploit, meaning the company didn't keep its systems up to date fully. All of these issues really manifest themselves with the problems we're speaking at today, which are bridging the digital divide, addressing the homework gap, and also finding ways to support and expand telehealth and government services to all the constituents. If we want to make the biggest differences in the communities we serve, these are the problems that we have to face. Both the federal government and states are taking this very seriously now. The pandemic highlighted this, again, as Aldona pointed out. But as I mentioned at the beginning, money is the greatest problem we face. For example, if the government's putting $300 million out to solve a broadband problem, that really translates to about $6 million per state. If it's $1 billion, that's roughly $20 million per state. And to understand the actual cost of putting infrastructure in place, the ERC was a subrecipient during the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, which started in 2010 and completed in 2012. And we utilized $10 million to build 110 miles of fiber. That actually only encompassed part of 3 counties. So we did some builds in Buncombe County. We did the most mileage construction in McDowell County. And then we partnered with other groups to build in Mitchell and Yancey County. And the frustrating part of that is because that money goes so quickly. And if I had my own do-over here, it would be very simply to think much bigger than I did at the time. Because I thought when I was proposing, hey, let's get $10 million to build out Western North Carolina, specifically in Asheville and other areas. If I could do that over, I would ask for so much more and try to accomplish so much more, but hindsight's always 20/20 there. I'm going to stop at this point though, and point out that every success we have here, be they small incremental steps or really big, massive steps, so getting that $10 million to build 110 miles of fiber all at one time, all of that is part of a process, and every step is a success. And unfortunately for us, it takes a long time to get to that ultimate end point, but that end point's also ever changing through the increased demand for video services and more. And on that note, I'm going to leave it to Q&A to follow up in greater detail with questions about federal levels or state support or anything else that anyone wants to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. And to your point, on the money, the financial side of the house, Aldona mentioned 90 million to build out Lexington, the 10 million. I mean, it's significant. And in terms of, again, your point on the federal level and where those resources really do, how much they can maximize in our communities. And so thank you for lifting that up and again, building on Aldona's points around the pandemic and how it has amplified with telehealth, with working from home, with school at home, just really has amplified the need for the infrastructure, but then to understand the infrastructure and how you can utilize it. So great points. And that's really where Deb will come in and shine a light on, once you have the infrastructure, what can you do with it? And, in Chattanooga, we're well known, and our organization as the Chamber, really amplifies our Gig City brand, our 600 miles of fiber. And, the impact that's had. Deb has really been a leader in activating our network, and we're so thrilled to have her. So Deb Socia is president and CEO of the Enterprise Center, a nonprofit that nurtures innovation in Chattanooga with the goal of connecting people to resources and building an inclusive community. Growing the entrepreneurial ecosystem and the innovation district, bridging digital equity, and supporting research and the implementation of smart city applications are all part of the Enterprise Center's focus. Prior to her current role, Deb was the founding executive director of Next Century Cities, a nonprofit that supports community leaders as they seek to ensure that all have access to fast, affordable, and reliable internet. Deb was the founding executive director of the Boston-based nonprofit Tech Goes Home, whose mission is to ensure digital equity. Deb's early career included 32 years as an educator and administrator. She was the founding principal of the award-winning Lilla Frederick Middle School, a Boston public school where she led the one-to-one laptop initiative. And again, you'll hear more about what she's brought to Chattanooga from this lens. Deb has been the recipient of many awards in her work, including a Community Broadband Hero Award, the Pathfinder Award, Leadership and Visionary Awards, the Google Digital Inclusion Award, and Motherboard Human of the Year. So please join me in welcoming Deb. And I will say all three of our panelists have a passion for their work, but they're also very clear about their purpose within this body of work. And Deb definitely emulates that as well. So Deb.
Thank you, Christy. We are known as the gig city. We're known as the scenic city. We'd really like to be known as the city that eliminated the homework gap long-term, right? That's really something we aspire to do. And I know, Aldona, you mentioned the economic impact of having a gig. We actually recently had a study released by Dr. Bento Lobo from the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, on the economic impact of the gig for our community for the past 10 years. And it was $2.7 billion worth, with a B, billion. That's a pretty significant impact. So I'm going to talk about Chattanooga and Hamilton County's effort to support our neighbors during the pandemic, and also to mitigate the impact of the tornado that tore through town in early April of last year. So I'll talk about community connectivity, which talks about short-term and long-term interventions, and I'll talk about digital inclusion. One of the challenges we have here in Chattanooga is that we kept ending up on the list of 100 worst connected cities. And the reason for that, even though we had fiber to the home, was that our state, there is a state law that prevents our local utility called the EPB, the Electric Power Board, from selling service at a cost that's lower than it costs them to provide it. And so our lowest cost plan was $27, which was too expensive for our low-income community. And so we had to come up with some other solutions to this. So there are a bunch of things happening here in Chattanooga, and I'll go through a couple of them quickly so you can see sort of the long-term effort and the breadth of the effort that we've taken on. We do convene a digital access and equity group, which has more than 60 local organizations and regional partners. And we take a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder view of the digital divide, which allows us to develop and implement really creative solutions. We also chair the Regional Broadband Alliance through our local organization, Thrive Regional Partnership, and that's 16 counties in 3 states. And our goal is not to be the island of gig access, but rather to ensure we are the whole region of gig access. So during the pandemic, in response to the tornado, we've done a whole bunch of things. The first one we did was we've given out 432 hotspots, computers, and tablets to 41 different nonprofits and faith-based orgs. So we wanted to make sure that the services that our community received in person could move online. And so we helped them each to learn how to use the technology. And so in the end, we had supported folks like hospice, digital domestic violence centers, the unhoused, remote job training, addiction recovery, creatives, religious services. So I'm going to pause for a moment on faith-based folks, because one of the things we knew was that the faith-based folks held a lot of trust in our neighborhoods. And we knew that this was a time when folks needed comfort and support from their pastor and their congregation. But we also knew that as the purveyor of trusted information, that pastor could share accurate information about what was going on in the community, and they would be trusted to tell the real information. So we really wanted to make sure they could continue to give services. And so we provided a hotspot, a tablet. We taught them how to use Facebook Live. We taught them how to collect tithes. And in fact, some of our pastors tell us that their congregations have grown and their tithing has never been higher. And so, the impact of that on our community, I think, was significant. In terms of connecting the unconnected here, we had something we called Quick Connect, which was one of our short-term solutions. And again, we worked with the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga's ITC lab to map out connectivity. In other words, where do we have lower broadband adoption? Where do we have our lowest income community members? Where are there lots of school children? And we layered on a bunch of data sets, which helped us understand where in our community we really needed to increase connectivity. We raised some money with some local foundations, and we and EPB put in 126, and UTC, a bunch of people. I don't mean to take credit, because credit is shared in a big way. 126 fiber-backed access points. So when you have a fiber and a gig backhaul, those access points are really powerful. And then we created a GIS map and optimized it for mobile devices. So our goal was for each person in our low-income communities to be able to use their phone to have access to a 5-minute walk to get free public Wi-Fi. We connected, we talked to all the churches and the businesses and the schools and everybody that could open their networks for us. So EPB provided the backhaul, which was really helpful to that. And we actually have some of these at housing authority buildings, in parks, at coin laundries, which was a really interesting connection, at churches, formal and informal hubs. We have had 104,000 user sessions as of the beginning of this month, and they used 51.5 terabytes of data. So that's a significant amount of data. So clearly it met a need. Prior to that, we actually had some public Wi-Fi in our community called NugaNet, and that pre-existed the pandemic. But we had 65 libraries and youth and family development centers that had NugaNet. And so during the year, even though those buildings were closed, we had 50,000 user sessions there with another 17.6 terabytes of data use. So big needs, and in a lot of ways that helped us to think about what else do we need to be doing here and what's our long-term solution. We're really lucky that we're in a community that has great collaboration. Our mayor at the time was Mayor Andy Burke, and the mayor of the county, Mayor Coppinger, and EPB's president, David Wade, the superintendent of schools, Brian Johnson. All these folks got together and we said, we need a solution. How are we going to fix this problem? And so the end result is something we call HCS EdConnect, Hamilton County Schools EdConnect, powered by EPB. And it is for all families of students who are on the National School Lunch Program or whose families receive SNAP. For us in this area, it's 30,000 students we need to connect. So what we are providing is no cost to the family home internet with at least 100 megabits symmetrical. Most people get 300 megabits symmetrical. We have a 10+ year commitment to that, and we started last August. So far, we've connected 14,000 students, impacted 25,000 people because the whole family has access. And that's nearly 1/3 of all of the students in Hamilton County. So we're about halfway to our goal of 30,000 students. So we really think about how that has changed. We really want to think about how that might change the lives of folks who had previously been unconnected, but also in terms of the pandemic, when you think about the impact of telemedicine and ability to work from home and entertainment and education and grocery delivery, all those things that folks with access had the capacity to do that our folks without access didn't. We actually have a large company here that will not hire anybody that doesn't have fast home internet, because in case they got to work from home. I mean, this is becoming so important in all of our communities. So the cost of this project was $8.2 million up front and a total of $15 million over the course of the next 10 years. We have almost met that goal. We're short by about $300,000. So we've done a pretty good job of pulling that together. And that money has come from the school department, from EPB, from Blue Cross of Tennessee Foundation, local philanthropy, the city, the county, and we were able to receive some CARES dollars that we were also able to contribute from our organization. But you know, all of this is lovely, but as Aldona referred to, having access isn't enough, right? We also need folks to understand how that access can help. And so we do run the program Tech Goes Home here, that the current version of which I helped create in Boston. And it's a digital literacy course. It's been here for 5 years. It involves 15 hours of training, and the training is about quality of life. We're not teaching folks how to use Microsoft Word necessarily, but really thinking about how do we use technology to improve the way we live, learn, earn, work, and play online. And so the training is flexible to meet the needs of whichever group of folks we are supporting. We give people a brand new Chromebook for a $50 copay. And then we give assistance to find low-cost home access. For some of those folks, it'll be HCS Ed Connect. For some of them, it's a 4G hotspot. And for some of them, it is Comcast Internet Essentials. So we've graduated 5,327 people in Chattanooga and Hamilton County since 2015. We work with 110 community organizations. We do a train the trainer model. So for example, if in a certain community, the librarian teaches the course, we train the librarian on how to teach the course. Very flexible model with curriculum and all the back end support that librarian might need. But because that librarian is in the neighborhood, it's a person already trusted. And I think trust is a huge part of this process. We need to really think about how we can gain trust and provide support. And so it's a train the trainer model. They train in the library in the neighborhood. And the nice part about it is next week, if the course is over and I have a question, I can go to that librarian still because she works in my neighborhood. So I love that. We've also trained 500 teachers here, because we know that most teachers can use tech to learn, but can they use tech to teach, right? And that's a totally different skill set. As an educator, I can absolutely say that that is the truth. And so we did a lot of work on that. We really try with Tech Goes Home to think of who is left out. And in our case, we know it's seniors. We work not just in Hamilton County, but in the 8 rural counties in our region to support seniors with Tech Goes Home. We work with non-English speakers. We work with early childhood educators. We work with pre-K school children who come with a trusted adult, like a parent or a grandparent or another adult. We work with folks who are blind or have a loss of vision, who are deaf and have hearing loss. We work with nonverbal children, their parents, and a speech pathologist to help them communicate across platforms. We work with entrepreneurs, creatives, small business owners. I mean, it's a wide variety. Re-entry folks, it's a huge number of groups that we support. And the last thing I'll talk about is just, we are doing research on this work because it is pretty interesting. The Boston College actually has some internationally known ed tech researchers who are working with us on this. And we're asking not just to evaluate the educational outcomes, but the quality of life outcomes for the families. So this whole project is focused on equity. How does access fundamentally impact the entire family? So we are in the process of a 3-year study, and we really hope we'll be able to share results as we move forward, not just so that we can build a better model internally, but also so we can help other communities see what's possible. We do have certain advantages here with the amazing collaborative community that we have, and that has really made a difference. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Deb. Hopefully you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Again, three different perspectives all building upon one another and deeply interwoven. So now we will move to questions. And again, as a reminder, please do put your questions in the chat. So first, we have a question from Kit with Asheville Chamber. COVID relief funding is being made available for expansion of broadband. What's your understanding of how much will be making it to your communities, and what do you plan to do with it? Hunter somewhat addressed this during his comments, but why don't we build on that from here?
So right now, as I understand it, there's roughly for telehealth oriented monies coming through the CARES Act. That's roughly 300. Well, there's 300 million coming for broadband infrastructure. For COVID, there's going to be, I'm trying to remember the exact number. I don't recall off the top of my head. There's 98 million for mapping, and I'm drawing a blank on that actual number, but I don't know how it's going to be broken up and how much is going to be coming into each local community. I can find it, hopefully.
Let me chime in, because I think what we're doing is we're still waiting for guidance out of the U.S. Treasury Department about the rules. There's really two pots of money. Some of it going to come from the feds, and then each state, Kentucky has actually allocated about 288 million, I think, for broadband. And it's going to come through our Kentucky Infrastructure Authority, but yet has no rules around it on how to apply or how the money is going to get distributed. And I think that that's what everybody is waiting for. In some cases, you know, it's our providers that are going to bid on it. They're going to have to make some investment themselves. So we're quite unsure. But I think what we are sure about, at least from the panelists, is that we all know we want to have a plan when we can understand and how this money is going to come to us. And that's what we're doing right now. We're doing the plan so that we know that when we will get the rules, that we can appropriately apply and get some.
I'll ask two questions. Oh, sorry, Hunter.
No, I was just going to come back and say there's two, there are block grants of $10 billion that are going to be coming in. There's also RUS funds that are going to be supported for RUS, and the rules are unclear, as well as how the distribution is going to be. North Carolina has its own pot of funds that it's going to be expanding its support of broadband infrastructure through the Broadband Infrastructure Office. And I can expand on that more, but I want to make sure Deb has a chance to chime in as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the challenge, there are a couple of challenges here. One of them is whether or not the funds will be allowed to be used for underserved communities, because the unserved and underserved designation is actually an FCC designation based on Form 477 data reporting, which is self-reported by the ISPs. And there are some challenges to that. In fact, the data is widely accepted as being inaccurate.
Right.
And so we've got a challenge with that we need to be able to watch what the rules are going to be around that. My suggestion at this point, because there is so much happening so fast, is that you connect with organizations that will do some of that sort of review and give you an overview. I'd recommend folks like the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, NTIA out of the FCC, out of the Department of Commerce, Next Century Cities, which I know Aldona is on the board of, and watch the FCC sites for webinars. I think I would be doing it that way, which is pretty much what we're doing internally to try and interpret what those rules might be as they come out, rather than feeling like we had to carry the whole burden. Let's talk to some experts. So that would be my recommendation.
Deb, well, you just mentioned one of the things, and that is the mapping that is there. And so many decisions over the years were based on that mapping, which we know was inaccurate, and really held back the investment in broadband, not just in our own states, but really around the country. I always go back and tell people, go back to, you know, how we built highways. That was 1956. the Highway Act. When President Eisenhower came back and said, look, I saw the Autobahn in Germany, and it was fast and it was quick and whatnot. And every community started to build an off-ramp. And that's how we did that as really from a protection perspective for the United States. Well, I want to equate broadband the same way. Give us something and then we'll build these off-ramps.
Yeah. It's tricky. It is a complex situation with the FCC's mapping, and we have not gotten a solution to it yet. And we keep basing decisions off inaccurate information.
The government, through the CARES Act, though, is trying to start addressing that, but that's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time. Also, the state of North Carolina has been pursuing its own mapping for quite a long time, and they are also looking to allocate more funds in North Carolina to continue its own until the federal government can catch up.
These are fantastic comments, and thanks for your responses to the question. I appreciate it. I want to come back to this, but we also do have a specific question in the chat for you, Deb, and that is, what is the plan to sustain the subscription for the 30,000 students? And then we'll come back to some broader questions too.
That's a really good question, right? Because in order to sustain this, there has to be repeated investment. So another thing the Tennessee state law requires is that we stay within our footprint, the electric footprint of EPB, and some of Hamilton County students live outside that footprint. And so we have to provide a different solution for them, which we are doing. But when we looked at the cost long-term, we took the cost of the infrastructure and we took care of that up front. That was $8.2 million. That reduced the monthly cost, right? Because when we get broadband connected to our home, we are paying some of those infrastructure costs over time. So we paid all that up front, which reduced the monthly cost. In addition to that, the funds are coming from the school department, and EPB is also supporting it. And so all of the students who are connected, there'll be one bill for all of them. And that one bill goes to Hamilton County School Department. So they have reduced their management side of that, and their debt collection and all of that's gone. They send a bill, they get one bill. And so we were able to reduce the cost per month to very low. And it actually can work within the school department budget to pay that cost. And we imagine that will be long-term. Certainly we have the 10-year commitment, but we don't think it'll stop there.
Great question and response. Thank you. Hunter, did you want to say something?
No, I was just unmuting.
Okay, perfect. So another question, again, feel free to add additional ones into the chat. But talking, of course, you've talked about your 3 communities. You're all very well studied in this space. Have there been creative solutions that you've either seen, you've read about, you're knowledgeable about in other communities that you'd like to lift up or like to tell us about today as well?
So let me just start out, because I'll start out from the technology end of it. I know that Hunter, you referred to as granite. Well, Kentucky is pretty solid mountainous in a lot of areas, especially Eastern Kentucky. But there are some solutions, and I'm looking at it from a building, the infrastructure. How can you do that easier, quicker, faster, whatever? And there are some European companies that are coming up with some very fascinating solutions. I don't know whether they're going to get acceptance in the United States, but there are people that are putting fiber into water lines, which is very interesting. I'm not sure that those are good solutions necessarily for a large city, but they have met with some success on what I would call point solutions. Crossing a river, crossing a creek. I have actually, as part of the build out of Lexington, we found abandoned sewer lines. Mm-hmm. And it was in those abandoned sewer lines that we were able to get permission to put fiber in them. that meant you didn't have to dig out and you were using them for a second purpose. But I think longer term, this is where the cities and the counties can address the issues of, if you're going to build a new community, a new development, and you're going to dig up the roads, you're going to put in water lines, you're going to do all that, do it once, put in fiber. And I think that we've talked about it theoretically, everybody says it's a good thing, but I'm not sure on a whole scale that we've done that. And I wish that I would have had more of those conversations earlier.
Just to expand on that, I believe that most cities repave their roads every 3 years.
Oh.
And so if they're being scraped, that's a good opportunity for someone to come in and I won't say necessarily put in fiber, but at least, because in North Carolina, we're prohibited in many ways from doing that, but put in conduit.
Right.
And then work with 1+ groups to access that conduit and be able to use that constructively to support perhaps multiple providers or multiple opportunities through education, healthcare, whatever, however it's deemed necessary.
So I'll put sort of a finer point on that and say a dig once policy. If your community doesn't have one, you should. I can help you connect to folks who can help you write one, but a dig once policy saves so much money in the process, whether you're going to do it or you're going to work with a private partner. So I'll talk about a couple of quick ones. The first one is a mesh project.
Yes.
Some communities are creating their own wireless mesh project for connecting a local community, a small area of a community. They have one in New York City, they have one in DC. Public-private partnerships like Westminster, Maryland, and the organization called TING, T-I-N-G. The county built out and TING runs on it. And so that's really helpful. Or an open access network. So Ammon, Idaho built fiber to every home, one neighborhood at a time. And they're not allowed to provide service, but they allow other people to run on their service. They have a gig access, really low cost, because they have competition, right? And competition really impacts that. And Hunter, another city that did a great job with conduit was Lincoln, Nebraska. And in the end, Lincoln actually gets paid to lease their conduit because they also can't put in fiber. But it has really been lucrative for the city. So they use dig once to get there.
Yeah. So let me, Deb, that mesh reference that you made, actually Lexington experimented with that early on, and we have not gone back and looked at it. And that was really our first sort of quote, free access in the city. Mm-hmm. What happened is that the companies got sold and resold and the technology, but I think it's emerging again. And Ting is a very interesting company. We've actually dealt with them. We met with them originally, and that probably might have been a candidate.
Mm-hmm. And there's also another opportunity. For example, a number of wireless groups work with the ERC by they attach to our fiber at a certain point, and then they use their wireless technologies to shoot further and cover out. And so that kind of a partnering opportunity really is advantageous, particularly in rural North Carolina. I mean, any rural community, that could be one of the type of solutions that helps.
Yeah, there's an interesting group in Minnesota, and it's like 3 or 4 counties and it's several cities, and they all work together. And they did something similar, Hunter. And what they've done is built fiber as far as they can build it, and then it's point to point or point to multi-point wireless. Right. But the promise is they'll keep getting that fiber closer to those homes, right? Mm-hmm. One of those communities ended up with, and this is really rural, ended up with a medical school because they had fiber. And so it makes a difference even in our rural communities in terms of our economic stability.
Well, also through advances in technology, though, if you extend the fiber into a community, you can tie into the old twisted pair copper networks and still deliver gigabit speeds over those. But again, just making sure the fiber gets to that neighborhood, as you're pointing out, is of the utmost importance.
Thank you all for your feedback on some of the other best practices as well. and I've always found, so in full disclosure, I worked for AT&T a few years, going back to the early 2000s. And, it's a complicated industry, right? A lot of people don't understand it. You have private players, public players, you have regulations, you have, again, demand like we've never seen. Deb talking about the utilization just here in Chattanooga. I mean, the demand and what we had seen is just sometimes overwhelming to think about. What are your thoughts to really move the needle going forward? What states are best players in this space in terms of, policy changes that they've driven, and why so? Is it on the infrastructure piece? Is it on the utilization piece? To Deb's point about, can you charge your customers at a lower rate than what it costs you? What are some of the star players in terms of state policy, in your opinion? And then how might we work together to continue to facilitate support on the federal level as well?
I'll talk briefly about state level. So there are 19 states that have either prohibitions or barriers to locally owned networks. So sort of the hunter's dilemma, right? But, and for us, that has been a bit of a challenge. I would suggest that we need to eliminate the state level prohibitions or barriers, mostly because I think we're in a crisis situation and it should be all hands on deck. And if a small community wants to solve their own problem, we should let them do it. That's kind of the American way, right? We just, we can figure out a solution locally and make it happen. And there have been a lot of challenges for that. And I'd like to see those removed. I think the other thing that we really need to start to promote better is competition, because what's happened is where there's no competition, the cost is so high, we still have a digital divide, right? Because the cost is too high. I think competition is really important as well.
So let me chime in because first of all, as a state, we don't have any restrictions. So from a policy perspective, that has been extremely good for Kentucky. But I do believe that competition, and I can offer a tremendous example from our own city. We had 2 players, we now have 3 players. Guess what? The costs have come down. Right. And contracts have become flexible or non-existent. A lot of things have happened. So competition is a tremendous service to the citizens, because if the companies are going to compete for the business, they're going to find ways for that competition. And it may be short-term lived, but ultimately the service gets better and the costs are cheaper. Long-term though, I think we've got to think in terms of regional development at some point, because these if it's an individual community wants something, yep, let's go for it. But ultimately, to make the investments in the technology that's going to be required over the years, I think a regional approach is going to benefit citizens. And the part that I think maybe Chattanooga has done so very well is really look at what does that mean from an economic development perspective? Because everybody's going to fight for jobs and everybody will want the better jobs. Those better jobs, like I said early on, is not picking up garbage. Those better jobs are going to be intellectually based jobs that can be performed over the internet or participate in some communities over the internet. So there are multiple challenges still to be had.
I'll point out 3 things. Deb's mentioned 2 of them already. The dig once policy and allowing cities and or counties to be able to put in infrastructure and then either lease it out or operate it themselves. Those are 2 of the 3 things that have already been mentioned, but also equitable access to poles.
Yes.
That would also be very beneficial.
I can't look at a telephone pole and not say, oh my goodness. Yeah.
Right.
That's great. Good feedback, everyone. Appreciate that. Thank you for that. By the way, as an aside, I know there was a question in the chat about having access to this session. If you know of someone who missed it, and yes, all panelists, or I'm sorry, all attendees will receive the recording of this. So you can indeed pass it on. Something else, thinking about, and I think Aldana and Hunter, you may have touched on this, but you all have been in this industry for some time. What is it you wish you had known when you started in the industry that you would have told yourself at that time to maybe, move the needle on digital equity further faster at that point in time?
Well, maybe I'll start. I thought, and I always hoped, that the build out would be faster. We got so used to the cable companies where you called up and you could get cable within a week, maybe 2 weeks. Well, and I think that was the expectation for many citizens. If we're going to get fiber, we're going to get it, like, let's just call up. So somebody actually called me and they said, if I called you, somebody told me that if I called you, I could get fiber to my home. And I think that's the part of the education that we didn't do very well. But ultimately, I think that we could have done what I call the prep work, the prep of the citizens, the prep of our departments, of our agencies, that if we can advocate for participation in this internet society that we're now in, that it would be better. It would be better from an education perspective, from a health perspective, from an economic development, from a job perspective. Right. Because was it you, Deb, that said some companies won't hire you unless you've got capability? I worked in the software business for 10 years, and I never saw the people that I worked with, but I was able to interact with them on projects around the world when I had to, because we could do it on the internet. And I think that that's the part that we have not sold that vision enough to our citizens and what that means.
From my perspective, I would suggest that we worked with the federal government much more early on to advocate for making the monies available to many more groups rather than simply to one large incumbent, so that if it were distributed further amongst small to mid-sized groups, then I think that much more would have happened rurally as opposed to how it has played out. And I think right now we wouldn't be trying to solve as great a problem had that occurred. So that's one of them. I mean, gosh, there's a laundry list that we could probably go through if we had the time, but that would probably be my number one. That, and also simply thinking bigger, because when I thought I was undergoing a huge project with BTOP, 10 years ago now, in hindsight, I wish I would have doubled or trebled it.
So I'm gonna go back to something we talked a bit about, and that's the mapping. I wish initially we had not accepted the Form 477 data as accurate, because it's not. It's self-reported and there's no check on it, right? And so the bottom line is, if you have a zip code or a census block, let's say census block, and one person in that census block can be covered by a large company, an ISP, they can claim the whole census block, and no money can be, federal money can be spent in that census block. And that's difficult for folks in that census block, because imagine how big a census block is in rural America. You understand that that's a challenge. I think the goal had to have been to really have a more significant plan that included every possible player, so that we could have built this out by now. The money that we have given out to the large incumbents to improve copper could have surely purchased fiber if we had been planful about it. And fiber is what we need to be future-proof.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. And that's, I think, where some folks feel daunted too, right? Is where do you spend the money? Is it in rural? Is it in urban? Is it fiber? Is it tools to then activate fiber? Where is it? And that is, it's a community region, that can really vary based on where you are. what do you feel your community's most important need is right now, looking forward, where we are with the pandemic, what's happening, how so much has changed, our reliability has changed, our demand for reliable service has changed. What are your thoughts about the most severe need facing your community in this space right now?
Well, I'll go first. I'd say, HCS Ed Connect is taking care of a large number of folks in our community who are struggling with a limited income. But we have a lot of folks that don't have children in school, right? We have people on fixed income, people with disabilities, seniors. There's so many groups that actually are struggling financially. We really need solutions that include all of them. And so, if I had a magic wand, that's what I would choose to do right now.
One of the things that you talked about is the whole issue about libraries and having libraries in your community because they're close. I don't know if you remember, but it must have been 99 maybe, it was the Gates Foundation that first brought computers into libraries. And that libraries then no longer just were basically tied to the books that were there, but they also became the teachers to the people that visited the library and wanted to at least learn about computing. And I think that if we could do more of that, we have, Lexington enjoys a tremendous number of parks, and we have community centers in many of those parks scattered throughout the city. We're now equipping many of those community centers with high-speed access. That's where the kids can come after school. They want to play some games or need to do homework if they don't necessarily have it at home. But it's also the opportunity to have people fill out their IRS forms, do their tax returns. So we've made those centers, and I think that we're going to do more of that, but that's on our agenda to do. Our parks have become the congregation area during the pandemic because you were outdoors. So the need for Wi-Fi, the need for cell service, because people were calling each other, they could still be outdoors, they could still play, watch their kids, order their groceries if they had to. And so I think that what is happening, and this is something that I wish we could do faster, and that's to spread out that capability faster throughout the community. Because as you use it, you learn what important part that is of your life.
And from my part, I would simply say, I largely agree with Deb. When it comes down to access, it's not just getting affordable access, but affordable access at speeds that support today's technologies. Right. And so it's a combination of two things there. And so I'm just expanding on that slightly.
And wouldn't it be helpful if the definition of broadband was not 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up? 3 megabits up in no way is going to support a home where the children are learning from home and the family is doing telework. So we really need to expand it. And if I had a choice there and I had 2 wishes, I'd go for 100 megabits symmetrical.
Yeah. I have one other thought, and that is that for the first time, we're talking about broadband as an infrastructure. And it took how many years to get to that? Because, we've always said you need electricity, you need water, you need fuel of some sort, whether it's oil or whether it's gas, to really power the economy and to power your homes. For the first time, we're talking about broadband as part of that infrastructure. There's an expectation, and I've got grandkids. There's an expectation by them that there is nothing in the world that isn't going to have broadband, because that's how they live. That's how they're going to do their work. They're going to maybe live in one state and work for 3 other states over their lifetime, never living in the same area because they can do their work remotely. So the fact that we have now labeled broadband as an infrastructure issue, I'm hoping that we are wise enough to really make that work.
For those of us who have been working on this for so many years, it feels like, the pandemic elevated the issue in a way we never could have otherwise. And I remember former FCC chairperson Mignon Clyburn said, when this becomes an economic development issue, it'll become important to everybody, and then we'll fix it. And I think she's right.
Yeah.
I think we had to make it about economics.
Well, we have definitely arrived there. That's for sure. That's something I know we and our partners on the call, live day in, day out. You all know and hear about it, the importance of your jobs to supporting overall economic development for sure. And another question, just thinking through, Deb talked about trust. You think about, individual users, you think about corporate users, right? And how trust is such a factor. And, Hunter bringing up the Colonial Pipeline breach, with all this talk about cybersecurity, I mean, what would you like to share with the audience as it relates to just the cybersecurity piece? And whether it's an individual or from the corporate lens, resources, access points, things that should be considered. Any thoughts in that space?
Well, let me start because I just talked about this about a few days ago. 3 things are required for cybersecurity. Number 1, management attention, and that doesn't make any difference what management that is. Secondly, tools, that's software, hardware, and keeping them up to date. So when somebody says you need to patch something, you got to patch it. Not wait. Doesn't go on a back burner. And the third is educating your users. Now, you can have the best software, you can have the best hardware, you can have the management attention, but if you don't educate your users, you really can't plan for that. And so cybersecurity is really part of the infrastructure of how we move forward. It has to be part of that. Because what you don't want is something like that pipeline. And by the way, DC had its own issues, ransomware of the police department. And with very, very serious consequences. And so those 3 things, it's a triumvirate, and you've got to pay attention to all 3. And with users, it's got to be a continuous education on what not to do. And I think what's going to happen, I know it's happening in our own environment. We're also looking to see, is all the equipment up to date? Is there something that we need to replace? Is there a patch that we need to do? And that cannot be deferred.
I'll say, New Orleans got their data hijacked, right? And
Yep.
kept for ransom. They had insurance that helped them recover.
Right.
Baltimore also had that happen, but they didn't have insurance, and it cost them many $1 million. So the investment up front is so smart because it's pennies on the dollar for what you're going to pay if you make the mistake. The other thing I want to mention is that from the perspective of a novice user, that trust piece can't be overstated, right? There's a quote, progress happens at the speed of trust. And that is one I use all the time because we aren't going to make forward progress if we haven't built trust. And so for a lot of our novice users, what they feel comfortable with is the Tech Goes Home website, where we have all of these trusted sites identified with tutorials. And they use our website as their portal, as they're learning, so that they don't feel they're going to get taken advantage of, right? Because we all know those stories about folks putting in information they should not have shared and then getting hijacked, right? So we just need individuals at the local level to be able to do that. And anybody in an organization, as Aldana said, we train our staff here all the time about new and upcoming ways that people can scam your company.
I simply want to point out that security can be automated in a lot of ways through technology, and that's a fine thing, but I can't understate what both Aldana and Deb said, that education and ongoing education is absolutely vital. I mean, as Deb was pointing out, we live in a trust economy. And if we don't trust the partners with whom we're doing business online, and increasingly everyone's doing business online, we are not going to be in the position to really grow, because everything we're doing is already moved in that direction. And right now we're just playing catch up. The education component is simply vital to help ensure people don't get caught. And phishing attempts nowadays are getting increasingly clever.
Yeah. I'll just give you one example, which is a bit scary. We had a phishing attack, and it was my account. They sent an email to the right person in our human resources department, basically to move my paycheck to a totally different bank. Automated deposit. The good part is that we have a little band that says this is coming from external sources, and pay attention to it. So that never happened. And the point is that that was just a very stark example, and those come all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, I every now and then someone on our team will say, Christy, you just emailed me for money again. And it's okay, here we go, you know. Someone's attempting again. But to your point, the education of your team, the education you know, of the public, it's so needed for people to just be aware, because yes, once you're compromised, it can be devastating in terms of time, resources, and emotions. So thank you for that reminder. Appreciate that. Well, any other thoughts you all have? You've been so gracious with your time and your perspectives. What have we not covered today that you feel like is really important that we need to share and get out there today?
I can start on that. The one thing I would suggest is that we all educate ourselves about what we need the federal government to do to help us solve this so that we can be good advocates, right? Let's fix the maps. Let's make sure we're building competition. Let's let every single entity that wants to work on this apply for the money, a co-op, a municipality, a public-private partnership, a region. Give everybody the chance to potentially be involved in finding local solutions. So those would be my two.
Thank you. Spencer, Alzana?
Yeah, I would very simply say that the more we work together, meaning when the Asheville Chamber of Commerce that partners with Buncombe County goes to the state to try to discuss how we can do more things together, they always reach out to surrounding chambers of commerce and surrounding groups, so such that the voice that we go together with is a greater voice. And I would suggest that we do that here in this regard with super regional groups, looking at the federal government to come out and have a stronger voice and a greater voice, such that it can be heard. And a lot of the things that Deb just mentioned can be accomplished and more.
You know, we've talked a lot about education, educating our management and our children and families. But I think that the one area that we have not talked about is educating our elected officials. And I think an opportunity exists for us, whether that's a state representative or a state senator, or in my case right now at the local level, our council members as they come into office, the criticality of the issues that we talked about, the fact that there are barriers, the fact that this is now an infrastructure. You know, we pay attention to our roads. We pave our roads. We're talking about infrastructure and our bridges collapsing. And one of the analogies that I use is that I have more highways, more bridges, more switches than anything else in the city, except you can't see them. And that we've got to pay attention to them and expand them. And so that's one way to start educating our elected officials about the criticality of this infrastructure that they do not see. Because, you know, council members get calls. I've got a pothole, the traffic's too fast, I need a speed bump. Well, you know what? They're probably not calling about the internet. But the chances are that if we educated our elected officials that this is just as important. That would be my wish.
That's a great way to end on, Aldana, I think, because you're right, that's something we all, that's a call to action. And I love how you all have taken this to kind of a call to action in closing, not only how we can work within our regions, but even, I think about my counterpart Ken in Asheville, and I think about Bob in Lexington. We're part of a national association. We're all involved. I believe we're all involved with the U.S. Chamber as well. And so kind of that role that we play within chambers to kind of pick up and work alongside all of you and make sure we are advocating at our state houses and at the federal level. And then, yes, educating elected officials as well, because you're right, when it's something you can't see, Aldana, it's just that much harder when your eyes can't necessarily see that pothole, the fact that the infrastructure isn't where it needs to be. So fantastic points. Well, I can't thank you all enough for your time today, for your leadership during such a critical time where so many people, to our point, earlier that you all made, the pandemic really has shown the light. It has been a bright light shining on broadband, fiber, the need for critical infrastructure so that we can continue to work remotely and learn remotely and be productive in providing services and products here remotely. So thank you all for what you're lifting up in your community, in our country, in our wonderful states as well. I'm seeing a lot of positives within the chat as well about the depth and breadth of the information you shared today. So with that, many thanks again to all of you for joining us. Thanks to Aldana as well as Hunter and Deb for providing us such rich content today, and many thanks to the Asheville Chamber and the Lexington Chamber for partnering with the Chattanooga Chamber to lift up these virtual intercity leadership visits, which none of us, by the way, have ever done before. Pre-pandemic, we always had to do this in person, right? And so this was really the Asheville team's idea, and we all jumped on and said, we love it, it's brilliant, let's try it. Let's test the waters. Let's be innovative. And without you, we couldn't accomplish that. So many thanks, everyone, for being a part of this session today. And we wish you good health. And let's continue to pray for our neighbors, look out for our neighbors, and continue to build on our economies, both within our states, our regions, and our local communities. Together, we'll continue to thrive. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.